All right, Daf Kuf Ches. We're going to pick it up from the Mishnah on Kuf Zayin and Beis. Tzairer Adam Basar Ugvina b'mitpachas achas. You can wrap your steak sandwich and your American cheese sandwich in the same peckle. Ubavachel yunoigen sebozeh. So as long as aluminum foil or a Ziploc bag is separating each one of these two things, they can both be in the same container, in the same bag. So while Chazal don't allow you to have the basar and the gvina touching each other, but they can be carried together as long as they're separated. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel Omer, Shnei Achsanayin, if you have two different guests that are staying in the same place, Oichlin al shulchan echad, they can eat on the same table. Zeh basar v'zeh gvina vein chayshishin. We're not worried about them eating at the same table because the assumption is they don't know each other, and therefore they're not going to be taking from each other's food, and therefore it's safe. Frak de Gemara, v'chinegeh zeh bozeh my havi. Who cares that the gvina and the basar is touching each other? Tzainain b'tzainainu. Both of them are cold, and therefore neither one is absorbing the tam from the other one. Amar Abaya, nihida klipa laboy. You're right. It won't require klipa because it's not absorbing, and therefore it won't require that outer layer to be removed. But hadacham ilay, you still have to rinse it off. So Chazal answered the gvina and the basar from touching each other because a person might forget to rinse it off, and then it might be over. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel Omer, Shnei Achsanayin oichlin al shulchan, etc. That the two different strangers at the same hotel can eat on the same table. We're not chayshish. Omer Rav Chanan Barami Omer Shmuel lo yishanu ela she'ein makirin zeh. As long as they don't know each other, they're strangers. Aval makirin zeh, but if they're buddies, it's usher for them to eat at the same table if one of them's eating bilchiks and one's eating fleishiks. Tanya nami hachi, as the Brisa says, Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel Omer, Shnei Achsanayin shinisachru lepundik echad. You got these two guests at one hotel. Zeba min hatzafain, the zeba min hadarm. One comes from the north, one comes from the south, implying they don't know each other. So zeba b'chasi chosei. One comes with his shtickle of fleish. The zeba b'gvinosei, and some comes with his shtickle of cheese. Eichlan al shulchan echad. They can eat on the same table. Zeb basar v'zeh gvina vein chayshishin. V'lo yasru ela b'tfisa achas. The Chazal only answered having the cheese and the meat together if it's in one peckle together, meaning they're touching each other. Frak the Gemara tfisa achas al kadaitach. You think the isser is only when the meat and cheese are actually touching each other in the same tfisa? We're more machmir than that, even if they're not touching, but they're not allowed to be on the same table. Ela kein tfisa achas, meaning there's no hecker in between. But if there's a hecker in between the two things, some mudna object that's there in between, which will remind them that they shouldn't eat from the milchas and fleishiks, and it's going to be butter. We know this from Hilchas Nida as well. It's about having that thing on the table to remind us. Omar le Rav Yemer bar Shlamya la Abaye. Shnei achin. Let's say you got two brothers, umakpidin zelzeh, and they don't like each other. So Mao, what's going to be the halachas? On one hand, they know each other, so maybe we should be chayshish, but on the other hand, they don't like each other, so they're going to leave each other's food alone. So Omar le Abaye says back to him, Yoimru kol hasrikin asur, and people are going to say all the other srikin are asur, usriki baisis mutarin, but the sriki of baisis is mutar, which is an expression that basically means we're not going to make exceptions. It's a loy plug. We're always going to asur. Ulitamech, and according to you, that the whole issue is we got to make a loy plug so people shouldn't make the mistake when they see it. Hada Omer Rabbi Asi Omer Rabbi Yochanan, Misha ein le ela cholak echad. If someone only has one piece of clothing, mutar lechabse b'chol shalmayid, he can do the laundry at cholamayid. But Yaimru, moving over to Aleph, kol srikin asur and sriki baisis mutar. You should have the same kind of svara. Why are we going to allow this guy to wash his own cholak? Why aren't we chayshish that people are going to assume it's going to be mutar to do laundry at cholamayid? And for the Gemara Hasam over there, we're not so concerned because Ha Omer Mar Baravashi Ezoyrei Meichiach Alav. His belt will be megala that he only has this one piece of clothing. In other words, people will understand that he's only going to have the one piece of clothing, and therefore we're not chayshish that people are going to start thinking it's always mutter to do your laundry on cholamayid. Now we get into some real hardcore Yeridea stuff. So the Mishnah, Tipas cholav shenafla ala chaticha. Let's say a drop of milk falls onto a piece of meat that's cooking in a pot. Now what's the matzav of this piece of meat? The piece of meat is not just sitting by itself. The piece of meat is sticking and partially submerged in a pot of food, a soup, a chullin, something like that. At least that's the way Rashi learns. So if the bit of milk that goes onto this meat is enough to be noisein tam, meaning it's more than shishim, then usr. It's going to usr that piece of meat. So like the Mishnah near a sakadera, though, if the person stirred the pot before that piece of meat now had the chance to get the tam from the milk, so now if the drop has enough milk to give it tam in the whole pot, then it'll be usr. Now that's all like Rashi, where the milk landed on the piece of meat that was sticking out of the pot, even though part of the meat was already submerged in the pot. Taisus argues, he holds that if the piece of meat was already partially inside the pot with the other food, we already reckon zach with the whole pot as soon as the little drop falls on that meat. You don't look at the meat separately. And therefore, according to Taisus, the case in the Mishnah and the Reisha was talking about where the piece of meat was completely outside of that pot. Maybe it was on top of other pieces pieces that were partially submerged, but the piece of meat in question was outside of the stew or the soup or the chont or whatever we're talking about. Zok the Gemara Omer Abaya. Tamai v'lei mamoshe be'alma dairaisa. The actual tam and not the mamoshes is still going to be osur midaraisa. This is another way of saying the expression that we're more used to of tam ki'ikr. The flavor without the actual mamoshes is still osur min hatayra. So it has to be that way because if you tell me the tam ki'ikr is only a din derabanan, mi basar b'cholav my time gamrin, and why wouldn't we learn that's osur min hatayra from basar b'cholav? Because de chidishu, basar b'cholav is a chidish. It's a davar that tzayser saklal. It doesn't make sense based on the rules we would typically know about. And ichidishu afal gav delekad naisin tam nami. But if basar b'cholav is considered a chiddush, then the basar that's cooked with the chalav should be usher even if it's not naisein tam. So why does the Mishnah say that the chalav that goes on the basar has to be naisein tam? Must be that the basar b'chalav is not a chiddush, and since basar b'chalav is not a chiddush, therefore we can learn out the halacha for other isurim from basar b'chalav that tam is ki'ikr. So Zot Abaya, from the very fact that our Mishnah is using basar b'chalav as a model to learn about this tam, must be that the basar b'chalav is not considered a chiddush. Amalei Rava says no, basar b'chalav is a chiddush, and therefore you can't learn out the halachas from basar b'cholav. If it's such a chiddush, then why do you need to come on to the tam? Why don't we just simply say that if the milk goes on the meat, even without any tam, it's going to become asr? Zok there because derech bishul asr Torah. That is gufa the chiddush haTorah that it has to be done derech bishul, and if it's not even enough to impart a tam, you can't say it's derech bishul. Now this that we're saying that it is a chiddush basar b'cholav. So the way Rashi learns is because each one of the ingredients independently is mutter, right? There's no isser of basar and there's no isser of cholav. Somehow you put them together and it becomes asr. That's a chiddush. Soiser saklal. Taisus doesn't like that because whatever happened to kilayim? There's nothing wrong with wool. There's nothing wrong with linen. Just by putting them together, that should also be the same kind of level of chiddush, but we don't call that soiser saklal. The panam yafais, the hafla in Chumash, says an interesting idea to be machalik between kilayim and basar b'cholav, because kilayim was independent and was never once together. However, basar b'cholav started off being together, and they were mutter in their matzav of togetherness. Then they got separated, and now they're put back together, and all of a sudden now it's usr. That's a much bigger soiser saklal than the shatnas, which was never allowed to be together to begin with. Okay, the Mishnah said in the first psak that if a tipas cholav fell on the piece of meat and the pot was not stirred, so then if the milk was naisein tam, it's going to be usr. So what's the it that we're talking about? So Omar Rav, it's talking about the ganze chont, the whole pot, not just that chaticha. Because kivin shenosin tam bechaticha, since the milk put tam into that piece of meat, and remember as way Rashi learns, it's partially inside the pot of chont, whatever it is. So chaticha atzma nasas nevela. This is the idea of chanan, that chaticha nasas nevela, that it's not just the milk inside that area of the meat is going to be usr, but because the whole piece of meat now becomes a shtek usr. It's intrinsically usr. V'aiseres kol chatichas kulum neishehein mina. And now, because of the idea of min b'mina is a bottle, because he holds like Rabbi Yehuda, that min b'mina is a bottle, all of the chatichas within that pot will subsequently become usr. Zok the Gemara. Omer le marzutra berei de Rav Mari le Ravina. Michti. Rav keman omer l'shmaita. Who's Rav going like? So as we just mentioned, Rabbi Yehuda, davar min b'mina le bottle, and therefore there's no bittel because it's all the same kind of min. But lema pliga ad Rava. Then that which Rav is saying should be connected Rava damer Rava, because Rava says kasavar Rabbi Yehuda kol shu min uminai v'davar achar. As long as you have something else besides the min b'minai, solak mino kamisha, and we take out the min b'minai if it's not there. V'she'ena minai rabba olavu mavatle, and that which is not the same min can now be mavatle. And therefore in our Mishnah as well, we should say that even though that first chaticha became usr with the basar cholav, and it actually puts out tam, it shouldn't make the other parts of that pot usr because you have shishim kenegdai. So Amar Le Ravina says back to Marzutra, Eden nafa beroitav raka hachinami. You'd be right if that milk fell into a liquid like a soup, and therefore you have so much more of that non-usr dika soup, which would be mavatal that chaticha that's usr. Aber hachba mayaskinan the nafal beroitav ava. The milk fell into a thicker kind of a gravy soup, which is full of basar, and therefore the whole thing is one big mitzias of basar, and therefore it's the same isser as the basar b'cholav. So had it been a roitiv raka in a chanami, it would have been mevatlet, but because the mitzias was a nafal beroitav ava, it won't be. Now, my kasavar, what is Rav saying lagabe that chaticha that had the tam of milk that went into it, but then afterwards was pilate it out? I kasavar efshel l'seichtei mutter. This is the other issue of efshel l'seichtei, that it's possible for that dvar osir to be seichtei, squeezed out of the chaticha, and therefore the chaticha goes back to the original matzav it was in beforehand. So then a chaticha might nas nevela. Why would our Mishnah say that the chaticha is nas nevela and therefore make the other chatichas osir? L'chayra, it's already been nischat, and now it should become mutter once that isser went out of it. Ela kasavar efshel l'seichtei is osir. As a step one, you have to first say efshel l'seichtei is osir, and now you'll say chanan that chaticha nas nevela. Dietmar, and I'll back that up by saying that Rav Rabbi Chanina Rabbi Yochanan da Amri efshel l'seichtei is usher, and it stays usher forever. Shmuel v'Rebbi Shimon bar Rebbe v'Reish Lakish ta'amri, efshel l'seichte is mutter. So once you squeeze it out, that chaticha goes back to the original matzav and then becomes mutter again. Frekting Gemara v'Savar Rav efshel l'seichte is usher, and it stays usher forever. I voit mar kazayis basar shnafel l'seichte yerush al cholav. Let's say you have a kazayis of basar that fell into a big pot of milk. So there's certainly shishim of cholav keneged that kazayis basar. Omar Rav basar. So Omar Rav basar usher v'cholav mutter. That piece of meat, that little shtickle of kazayis meat, is going to be usher. But cholav, the whole big pot of milk, that's going to stay mutter. The basar is going to be usher because now it has the tam of the cholav in it. But the milk is mutter because any tam from the basar that went into it is batal klape the 60th keneged. Now, if you're telling me that Rav holds that where that iser dika tam was squeezed out of the chaticha, it will remain usher, turning over to Tamid Beis, cholav amai mutter. Why is the big body of milk in this pot going to become mutter? Cholav nevelahu. Now that cholav that was absorbed by the meat is a nevela, which is the expression meaning it became usher. And therefore, when that milk subsequently is pilot, that kazayis basar, into the rest of the milk in the pot, and because of min b'mina lebatel, it should usher all the milk in the pot. So a combination of efshel seichte usher, chaticha nas nevela, and min b'mina lebatel is going to make all the milk in the pot usher. And for the Gemara li'olam kasavar Rav efshel l'seichte usher in a chanami, it's going to stay usher even after it's pilot from that shtikala. But shani hasam lagabe, that milk that was absorbed by the basar that went out, that won't usher the rest of the milk because the Omar Kro leisavashel gedi b'chalevimai gedi usher tayrav cholav. This is an amazing chiddush dika suggestion the Gemara is making, that you know what's usher? Only the gedi, only the meat part, but the milk part doesn't become usher with basar v'cholav. Frak the Gemara, how can you say that? The savar of gedi usher tayrav cholav, you're suggesting there's no usher basar v'cholav on the milk, only on the meat? Let's say you cook together a chatzizayis of meat and a chatzizayis of milk. So Amarav, like al achilasa, you're going to get malchus for its eating of it. Now so achila lamai like it. Why am I going to get malchus for eating this kazayis of basar and kazayis of cholav? L'chayra chatzishiru. We're saying only the basar side is the basar b'cholav problem, but not the cholav side, and therefore you're not eating whole shear. Incidentally, Rabbi Kiveger points out, how are we talking about eating a chatzizayis of cholav? Cholav is a liquid. It should be a shear or a revius, in which case there should be no ability to combine the chatzi zayis of basar with this liquid shear, because there are also two different things that should not be mitzdarf to create a total shear. And you can listen to Rabbi Gross for his suggestions to that kasha. Elali elam kasav Rav cholav nami aser. Must be the Rav holds that the cholav of vada is aser. When you have basar of cholav, not just the basar is aser, but the cholav is also aser. But b'hacham ma'askinan, why did Rav say the whole pot of milk would be mutter? It's because that little shtickle of basar that fell into a pot of milk, it's a boiling pot of milk. The mivla bola mifla where the little shtickle of meat absorbs milk, but now that basar b'chol dik of milk that was in the meat does not become pilate back into the pot. Because it's boiling, it's not pilate. Taisus doesn't like that as pshat because we see it's not true, especially and the whole idea of Hagala is that things can be pilate out even when it's boiling. As Taisus asks in his kasha, tamed over hanir le'naim hu depolit. We can see that it works. And Taisus goes on to say a different pshat. Meanwhile, back to our Gemara, frak the Gemara, soif kinayach hoder polit. Lamaisa, when the boiling finishes, that piece of basar is still going to put out the treif of milk back into the pot, and therefore it's going to be b'mina, it's going to be usher. So how can Rav say the milk is going to be mutter? And for the Gemara, kishakadam v'silkai, we're talking about where the person got rid of that little shtickle of meat before it stopped boiling, and therefore there was no problem. Getting back to the halacha we just said, gufa chatzizayis basar v'chatzizayis cholav shebishlan zem zev. You cook them both together. Omer Rav leika al achilasay v'leino leika al bishulay. You're going to get malchus because you ate a full shear, but you're not going to get the malchus for the bishul. How do you understand such a shita? Im mitzdarfen a bishul nami lilki, and ilay mitzdarfen a echila nami lilki. Which one is it? Is it basar b'chalav? Is it not basar b'chalav? And for the Gemara, li'elam loy mitzdarfi. Ubeba miyera gedela. We're talking about you're going to get malchus. We're talking about when you ate 2 half zaysim from a big yaira in which there was taka a kezayis of meat and a kezayis of milk that were cooked together. So that's the ukimta. But levi amar afleik al bishul. There is going to be malchus for the cooking, even when you're doing the chatzizayis of each, half milk and half basar. V'chein tani levi b'mas nisa. Kashem shaleik al achilasai kach like al bishul. It's true, you do get malchus. Ube'eze bishul amr. What kind of cooking are we talking about? The bishul shacherem oichlon yesay machmas bishulo. When somebody else, meaning when goyim would eat the food based on that kind of cooking. And the way Rashi says it, it means it was completely cooked. There are some that want to learn in this Gemara, and even the Ritva says in Rashi that we're talking about Michael ben Drasai. It's a little hard to read that in the Rashi. Upon that's going to be the shear of the Isser Basar B'cholav is when it becomes edible. And we're going to stop here and we'll pick it up with Efshel L'Seichtei for tomorrow's daf.